Again, I'm Dan Costa, the Chief Content Officer at Worth Media, Editorial Director of the Techonomy Climate Conference. The conference is going to be on March 28th in Mountain View. We've got executives from Microsoft, Salesforce, Autodesk, and a host of other climate tech startups and activists. I encourage you to sign up. There will be a link in the chat section of this broadcast. We are holding this conference in partnership with the Environmental Defense Fund, and that is who we have with us today. Britt Groosman is the Vice President of Climate Smart Agriculture at EDF, where she helps create environmentally effective and economically sound solutions for working landscapes. And that includes farms, ranches, and forests. Britt, thanks so much for taking the time and talking to us today.
Well, thank you for having me. Agriculture is often a neglected sector in the tech space or in climate discussions. So I'm glad we are inching towards that kind of little bit of public recognition.
Very good. Yeah, and I want to get to that. I just want to let people know if you have questions, you can use the question box in the Zoom, and we will get to those either throughout the conversation or at the end of the conversation. But you bring up a great point about agriculture and climate tech. When people think about climate change, they tend to think about big factories, billowing smokestacks, exhaust pipes on SUVs, spewing out toxic gas. But the problem is actually much bigger than that, and a lot of it has to do with the agricultural sector, correct?
Yes, I want to kind of flip the question first for a second as well, because there's always two sides to the coin here. Agriculture is also the sector that is most reliant on weather and availability of water. And so it is at the forefront of feeling the climate impacts. So when we're talking about climate, agriculture is a really important sector for that reason and because of the livelihoods and the food security issues that go with that. In addition, it is true that agriculture does have a fairly large footprint. It's about 10% of overall greenhouse gas emissions. That might not seem that high, but that is actually a lot higher than, for instance, the cement industry or other industries that you may think about more often. In addition, methane, which is a gas that at EDF we've been really looking into for the past decade, it's a fast-warming gas. It's the gas that about half of our warming in the next decade will be because of methane. And about 40 to 45% of methane comes from the agricultural sector. So it is actually, in terms of when you and I go out and we're like, I live in New York City and there's no snow, and I'm like, oh my God, I'm really feeling the changes in my lifetime. This is no longer a scenario of science fiction. That's where methane is really important, and that's the ag sector is also really important.
So what is it? I mean, I don't want you don't have to go into that much detail, but what is it about methane that makes it so pernicious? 80 times the warming properties of carbon dioxide. What is it about methane that's such a unique problem?
Well, it's just a very fast-warming gas. And I'm not a scientist. I encourage you all to watch the TED Talk by my colleague, Elissa Oko, who explains in really simple and in short time span why methane is so important. But it is basically, it's a gas that after 10 years disappears out of the atmosphere. But while it's in the atmosphere, it just captures a lot more warming.
So you mentioned that being in New York City, we can feel the effects of climate change, but there's really the way climate change is affecting people really depends on where they live, how they live to a degree. There are regional differences that are really significant, and I know EDF is looking to sort of study those, examine those, and put solutions in place that will address some of those regional issues. Can you dig into that a little bit?
Yeah, sure. Yes, absolutely. So climate change is not going to be felt by everybody in the same way, not in terms of the amount of warming, and also not in terms of the way that we are resilient to it. People who are living on coastal areas that will get flooded will feel it more. People who are living around the tropics who are part of fishing communities, they see their fish stock disappearing. People who live in areas like California, where now you have prolonged droughts, you have fires, they will feel it differently as well. And quite often, unfortunately, what we call in the US, the environmental justice communities, who already bear the brunt of any environmental pollution, will again be at the forefront of feeling the impacts on a daily basis.
So what are the steps to sort of to help farmers and people in the fishing community specifically? Like what can be done to sort of insulate them from these effects?
Yeah, so there's a couple of things that we want to do again at EDF. We want to look at those two sides of the coins, right? So we want to make sure that we try to get emissions down as fast as possible globally, not just from the ag sector, but from all sectors, right? Because it doesn't matter where the climate pollution comes from, either regionally or from one sector, it will affect farming and fishing communities. So that's one thing. So we're all out at EDF on things like electric vehicles, decarbonization of the energy sector, decarbonization of the ag sector, et cetera, et cetera. So that is going to be across the board a huge thing that we need to do, especially on things like methane, when we're really talking about near-term warming. In addition, we then need to recognize that we're now in our lifetime at a point where we can no longer say it's a science fiction piece. This is happening and it's happening now. And it's happening differently in different regions. So we need a couple of things. We need better data. So we need to really be able to start preparing communities for what is likely to happen in their region, in their sphere of interest. For instance, we just recently released a report that looked at different commodity crops in the US, in different states, and how those would be affected by 2030 by climate change. For instance, this was corn in Iowa and wheat in Kansas, soybean in Minnesota. So we're trying to look at what is important to growers in certain regions and how will that specific crop likely be affected. That's the first thing. Knowledge is power. We might not always be able to really change. There's certain things, there's a certain amount of temperature increase that unfortunately is baked in. I hate to say it, I'm a mother. I hate to say, I've been working on this for 20 years and we failed. We failed to, get the certain amount of warming is baked in. So what we then need to look at is, well, what can we do to adapt to become more resilient to what we know is happening? So how can we grow crops that maybe need less water because we will not have as much, or need less rainfall? How can we ensure that the crops we grow are resistant to the increased pest pressure that we expect? We're expecting more insects and more pests. How can we help some farmers and communities find alternative income streams where there really will be a problem in terms of growing something? This is a similar issue with the energy transition. We often talk in the environmental community about the just transition. If you have coal mine workers, you don't just want to pick people out of a job. You want to recognize that some of the capabilities that they have in the labor force are always also really useful on working on certain renewable energy things. Similarly, in the ag sector, there might be things that can be done, just a different practice or a different crop, or at worst, a transition away to another, doing something else in that area that will give value, and income to your family. And we need to do this as a community, not just EDF, not just particular people, but the world needs to do this globally, because this is going to be felt from the north part of Russia to the south of South Africa, right? This is going to be everywhere. And so it's an all hands on deck. I kind of think about it as a big Marshall plan of planning that we need to do about what are we expecting in terms of impacts and what can we really start giving solutions. And the third piece of that is, we need to know what's happening, the science. We need to think about what alternatives we could be doing, whether that's a practice change or an agricultural practice change or a different crop. And then the third really important piece is helping build a system that allows for adaptation. And that's where things like policy, financial tools, technology all come in, because it's all very well knowing that we can't grow X anymore, we have to grow something else. What if your crop insurance doesn't support that? What if your ag loan is based on past yield and now you don't have a past yield because you're growing something different? There's all those kind of things. We need to set up a support system that allows and encourages adaptation. So I hope that helps.
Yeah, I think that you bring up a really good point, is that, again, we tend to focus on the emission side of the equation, that the agriculture sector is a source of carbon emissions, but every industry in the country is a source of carbon emissions right now. And I think it's important not to forget that in this transition, whether we like it or not, a lot of these industries are going to be transformed by these temperature changes. Agriculture, perhaps more than most. And we can't forget that there are real people whose livelihoods and businesses are going to be affected by that, which is sort of in your title. One of the things that jumped out at me is that it's about building economically sound solutions, not just trying to affect this global crisis, but building new systems that can actually operate under these conditions. So I think that's something that often gets lost. What are some of the things that the agriculture sector can do to actually limit those emissions as they do these transitions? What types of practical steps can they take?
Right. So if we think about, for instance, in the US, the 10% of the overall emissions that come from the agricultural sector, there's a couple of main buckets of where those emissions come from. So one is the methane gas that comes primarily from the livestock sector. And there I can talk, pun intended, until the cows come home about cows, if you want to take it that direction. Then there is nitrous oxide, right? That's the gas that gets released when we overuse fertilizer. So if you throw fertilizer on a plant, sort of seeds and crops, if you put too much on it, or you put it on at the wrong time of the year, you will get losses. Those losses will come in two forms. Either the losses will go to waterways, and that's where you get your dead zones and your dead fish and all that kind of stuff, and your algae, or it will basically go to the atmosphere. And nitrous oxide is also a highly potent greenhouse gas. And then the third bucket is there was a little bit of energy use, obviously, like every industry, agriculture has transportation. You have your tractors running on diesel and all that kind of stuff. So obviously, great if we can get all of that decarbonized as well. But the third big piece is the sort of potential conversion of basically soil sinks. Wetlands, grasslands, peatland that currently has a lot of carbon in the soil. If we were to convert that to agricultural land, start tilling it, we would literally be releasing those carbon storage ponds. So those are three big buckets that we need to start thinking about when we think about where can the agricultural sector itself be part of their future, in terms of they can help themselves limit that warming that is going to hit their sector the hardest.
Yeah, so you opened the door on cows, and I have to say, I kind of want to walk through it. I love my beef. I love a good steak. I'm not really willing to give it up, but at the same time, if you look at the data and you look at the efficiency of the agricultural sector that is dedicated to cultivating beef, it's got huge outsourced impacts. And I think it's easy to say, like, the world would be a better place if Americans in particular ate less beef. I mean, is that a fair statement?
Oh, it's as you say it yourself, it's a very personal choice, right? Food is one of those things that is part of our identity almost. Often it comes down to, like you're an Italian, or like you're from whatever country and you have food associations with that. And so it's something that is really hard to change, right? I was reading that even some of the Greek philosophers were vegetarian, and yet we are still meat eaters as primarily as a sort of human race. Without totally sidestepping the question, I just want to push on the fact that methane is a fast warming gas, that it'll be responsible for almost half of warming over the next decade. In fact, over the next 7 to 8 years. We need faster solutions than I think a dietary cultural revolution will get us to. So at EDF, we are focusing more on the footprint of the meat or dairy that people consume, rather than whether they are consuming it at all. So, for example, cows burp. They have, you've all learned about this since we were kids. Cows have this amazing digestive system with different stomachs, and they can basically digest food that we couldn't eat and still get some energy from it. But they're also not the most efficient at transforming the food into energy, because they burp, and that's where they release the methane. Often, I hope I can say that out loud, often people talk about the cow farts. That's a fallacy. That's not where the methane is. It's all in the burps. And so one of the things that some innovators are looking into, and some scientists are like, can we feed the cow something in addition to what they're already eating, that will basically make them digest better, make them use more of the energy and not release it. And so that is kind of one of the big targets that we are going for. If you're kind of, I was just thinking about the title of the tech convening. If you're really kind of, thinking about what is this kind of target that would be amazing if the human race could put all their minds and some money and some innovation towards, that is a big one. There is innovation in that space, of course, but we need more and we need it faster.
Yeah, I think I read a study of farmers in New Zealand feeding cows seaweed, basically seaweed products that dramatically improve their digestion and reduce greenhouse gases the belching, but significantly, which it seems like a quite promising development. I mean, what do you? There's going to be. We're having our conference in Silicon Valley. There's going to be a lot of engineers there. There's sort of an engineering mindset. Where do you stand on sort of the engineering innovation solutions to address these issues? How confident are you that we can sort of, if not innovate our way out of this problem, at least make it a little bit easier to deal with?
I'm very confident. I have to be. I'm a pragmatic optimist. I have kids and I work in the climate space. You have to be either crazy or be that optimist, right? So I think there's a couple of things. First of all, you mentioned seaweed. There's also a couple of other sort of chemical components that are currently being tested, and they show some promising results. They're still being tested for things like, obviously, safety to the animals, safety to human consumption, and how effective and efficient they really are. But really exciting, and we need more in this space. It can't just be one or two products. We need more. We need it to get to a space where there is also healthy competition, and then eventually a price point where farmers can afford it. Because you can imagine if there's like one or two companies in the space, that maybe you might be able to at some point eat a high valued steak in a Manhattan restaurant that is lower carbon. It's not really what we want. We want everybody's beef and dairy consumption to be of a lower footprint, right? So we need a lot of excitement into this space. The other thing I haven't mentioned yet, again, still with cows, is the manure issue. So there is also a problem with the way we store manure in high concentration livestock areas where there is a lot of it, and it creates a chemical reaction, and we have methane released. There are biodigesters now where you can capture that gas, and it basically gets reused because it's basically natural gas. You can use it in a cook stove, you can run electricity on it, etc. But it really only works for very large cattle operations because you need a lot of it. There's I think it's like $2 or $3 million to build one of these biodigesters. What I would love is for some engineers to develop digesters or something completely different that works in smaller operations, so that we can have solutions that are more scale neutral, that do not lead the market towards more concentration, which is what nobody wants. Nobody wants dairy farmers to go out of business. Nobody wants big livestock concentrations for odor and all kinds of other EJ concerns. So we need other solutions. So those are two kind of cow pieces that we need. Then there's the nitrogen piece. There's how can we make fertilizer more efficient? How can we make the product itself more efficient? How can we make the application of it more efficient? What kind of robotics, what kind of machinery? How can we make it so that we don't have as much waste of this product than we do, which is both a waste to, the pocketbook of the farmer, with fertilizer prices going through the roof since the Ukraine crisis, but also for the environment. We don't want it to go in the water. We don't want it to go into climate. Again, we need technology solutions and application solutions, but we need both. Those are just two of the big ones that I think of where we need a lot of help in the sector. And kind of putting in a little plug, on Monday, we actually have an EDF report that will come out that looks at some of the technology options for climate smart agriculture. So we hope to get some interest and to have lots of people that follow you sort of think about, well, we should start investing in this space. Please do not neglect the ag space. It's so crucially important.
Yeah, well, we're going to have a couple of people at the conference at the end of the month that are going to be focusing on that space, and hopefully a number of VCs that are going to be funding development in that space. Another source of funding that's recently come online is the IRA, the unfortunately titled Inflation Reduction,
I know. Yeah,
which is probably one of the greatest pieces of climate legislation, certainly that this country has ever passed.
absolutely.
How do you think, as that money starts to come online and starts to flow, there's so many incentives in there. What do you see its impact being on the agricultural sector?
It's huge. As you say, it is, well, first of all, I've been working on climate policy in the US since 2008. This is the single biggest climate bill we've ever seen. They might not be called it, but that's what it was in terms of its effect. And it is the first one that really included the ag sector ever, right? The ag sector was always deliberately carved out because the policymakers were worried that they weren't going to get it passed if it did include. But it also, therefore, didn't allow for this innovation in this sector that does have a footprint and that will be impacted so much. So the current Inflation Reduction Act had about $20 billion put aside for the agricultural sector. USDA and others are looking very carefully at how to ensure that that has the highest impact. A lot of that money will go into helping to measure what is there, which is a crucial component if you want to create any kind of incentive system around reductions, right? If you don't know what the emissions are in the first place, you can't measure what the emission reductions are, and therefore you can't reward that in one way or another, whether it's through a business scheme or a carbon market scheme, etc. Then there's going to be lots of investment into piloting different practices and seeing what effects they may have. It's really sort of a huge injection into trying things out in the US ag sector. We're very excited about it.
Do you think a lot of that money is going to wind up going to because the agricultural industry in the United States is pretty consolidated with a few big players.
Yeah.
It seems like that's where you will make, I live in the Hudson Valley. We have a thriving local farm community, but they're all small farms. We almost need to make change at scale, and that means making change in big agriculture, not just local farms. Is some of the money going to be spent there to sort of foster innovation?
Yes, no, it's going to be really important that that the money goes to different scales. And right now, there is still a range of consultation processes undergoing where they're really looking at where it is best suited to be spent. And I think there's also going to be some focus on underserved communities. USDA has recognized that in the past they've had impacts that were basically racist. They recognize that, and I think they are really trying hard to try and overcome that. In addition, the sector has seen a huge concentration push, and that is, of course, bad for small communities and rural livelihoods. But on the other hand, the big farmers are often the ones that are more able to trial new things. They're the ones who can try whether a new tractor gives them a better efficiency in their fertilizer rate. And so we really need to see the incentives across the board and avoid vilifying one part of the sector against the others, because we need to see innovation in all the parts.
Yeah, as I almost did with the beef industry just a few moments ago. We're going to open up the questions soon. If anybody's got a question for Britt, type it into the question box. But Britt, maybe step back and say, once the IRA has passed and that impact is felt 5 to 10 years, let's say 10 years down the line, how is the agricultural industry different, both in the US and globally? Just your predictions.
I think, pink glasses on, we will see a dairy and beef sector that not only knows what their methane footprint is, but that has solutions in hand to reduce them. We will see the row crop sector, that's the big fields of rows and rows of the same grain or corn, being much more judicial about how they use fertilizer. We will also see a more careful thought process about what we're planting where, especially with considerations like water availability.
Yeah, I think that's almost going to be a necessity because the things that we are growing in certain places are just simply not going to grow there naturally in the future without massive irrigation and fertilization.
Yeah, irrigation with water we won't have, so that's the problem. Yeah. Yeah.
I'm hoping, I think the Hudson Valley is pretty well situated to ride out most, a little bit of this. But I think especially on the coasts, and there's going to have to be some major adaptation in, that's going to be required.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Well, Britt, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us today.
Yeah,
we're going to continue this
absolutely.
conversation on techonomy and at the conference. And I'm really appreciative you took time out of a busy Friday to sit down and talk with us.
As I said at the beginning, thank you so much for allowing me to talk about the importance of agriculture. It's always great to have an extra platform. Have a great afternoon and good luck with the conference.
Thank you so much. Take care, Britt.
Thank you. Bye.